Charlene Margot, and I'm the founder of the Parent Education Series, now in its 15th year, and proud co-founder and CEO of our new nonprofit, the Parent Venture. We could not be more excited to have with us today Dr. Angel Perez and Alice Kleeman. And we know with over 750 registrations that this topic is of vital importance to parents. What is the future of college admission? How will the pandemic affect it? We're going to be talking about those questions and a lot more today. So before I introduce you to our panelists, I just want to tell you a little bit more about how the event today is going to go. First of all, we are incredibly grateful to today's sponsors, the MAPTA, the Sequoia Healthcare District, the Sequoia Union High School District, and the Parent Venture. Without you, these wonderful events would not be possible. So thank you to our sponsors. Then we are going to have today about 30 minutes of conversation that is literally Alice Kleeman will be our moderator, Angel Perez will be answering questions, and after that, we will have a Q&A period for you, the audience, to ask your own questions. We would like you to use the Q&A button, again, at the bottom of your Zoom screen, rather than chat. In chat, you'll see some great resources and links. Feel free to talk to us, talk to one another, but we'd like you to put your questions in the Q&A box. And if you could, please keep those questions general so that they will be applicable to as many viewers as possible and kind of brief. We know that there will be lots of questions and we're going to do our best to get to as many as we can. And finally, I want to let you know that this event will be video recorded and shared on our YouTube library for those of you who may not be able to watch live today or want to share with a student, a spouse, a partner, or anybody in your community. Okay, let's get started. First of all, Alice Kleeman. Alice worked at Menlo-Atherton High School as the college advisor for 20 years until her retirement in 2015. Since then, she has continued to help students find their way to college through MA, the Boys and Girls Club of the Peninsula, and the Redwood City Library. During her career, Alice was active in the National Association for College Admission Counseling, the Western Association for College Admission Counseling, and the College Board. For more than a dozen years, she served on the faculty of the College Board Summer Admission Institute, a 5-day professional development opportunity for new college admission counselors. When Alice retired from MA, a scholarship was begun in her name, and the students have been awarded so far are experiencing success in college. Selection is based on motivation. But as always, as Alice says, her proudest accomplishment is her 3 children who all teach in the Menlo Park City School District, grades 8, 5, and 3. Thank you, Alice, for joining us today. A pleasure as always. And now, Dr. Angel Perez is the new CEO of the National Association for College Admission Counseling. You may know it as NACAC. In this role, he represents nearly 14,000 admission and counseling professionals worldwide committed to post-secondary access and success. He is recognized as a national thought leader and is a sought-after speaker on issues of educational equity, access, and success in American education. Prior to his arrival at NACAC, Angel served for 22 years as a leader in higher education, where his work was described as transformative. He most recently served as Vice President for Enrollment and Student Success at Trinity College. You may remember Alice and Angel from the stage at Menlo-Atherton High School about a year ago. Perez is passionate about public policy as a platform for change. He was chosen by the Gates Foundation to serve on Forward 50, a group of leaders presenting higher ed solutions to Congress. And in 2019, a Forbes article named him the greatest influencer in college admission. Dr. Perez's work has been featured in many media outlets, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, NPR, and CBS Evening News. Please join me in a very warm welcome for Angel and Alice. Take it away.
Thank you, Charlene. We are delighted to be back. As you mentioned, Angel and I talked last year, and we were discussing 20 years in the world of college admission. What has changed over those 20 years and what hadn't changed over those 20 years. I went back and looked at the topics that Angel and I addressed, and I'm going to just mention them really quickly now because it's interesting how many of them are still important and yet how much has changed. So last year we talked a lot about stress and anxiety among students and families. We talked about testing. We talked about financial aid. We talked about media attention to college admission. We talked about technology. We talked about the kinds of people who are helping students go to college. We talked about a general awareness of the issues that face first generation to college students. We talked about institutional priorities or the values that colleges have when they're choosing their students. We talked about undocumented students. We talked about community college. We talked about issues of privilege and race. And we also talked about one of my favorite issues, which is trust. So that's where we started. Let's take it from there to the future. And that future obviously has been affected by COVID. So Angel, when you first took your position as CEO of NACAC, you went on a listening tour, and you went on a listening tour all around the world to hear from all the various stakeholders in the college admission world. So I have a short and a longer question for you about your listening tour. First, can you just tell us briefly, Charlene mentioned it briefly, but can you talk very briefly about NACAC, what it is and who is part of it? And then can you tell us at more length what you heard on your listening tour? What were people excited about? What are they concerned about? What are they tackling as individuals or as groups? Thank you.
Thanks, Alice. And it's so great to be here. And I'm just so sad that we're not in person. It would be much more fun if we were together in Northern California. Because I miss traveling and because I miss California, I am sipping my coffee from my I Love You California mug in honor of all of you in California. And I know people are around the world on this webinar as well. You know, the National Association for College Admission Counseling, as Charlene mentioned earlier, is an association of over 14,000 professionals, mostly high school counselors, folks like Alice who have dedicated their lives to helping students in schools to transition to college advising. And then I would say the other half of our population are admission officers, deans of admissions, admissions counselors who are doing the work every single day of admitting students to college and recruiting students around the world. So it's a really interesting organization. It does advocacy on behalf of those individuals, education, training, convening. But we've also pivoted a lot recently to do a lot of advocacy, particularly around the politics in this country that sometimes disadvantage students and underrepresented students as well. So it's an exciting new position. I just passed my first 100 days on the job and really excited. But in regards to the listening tour, when I first joined the association, I thought it was really important to go on a listening tour. And you said, Alice, around the world, that was really on Zoom, but it did represent members of ours who are literally located all over the world. And there were a couple of themes. A lot of the themes that came up were specific to the association and what members would like us to be doing. But I would say there's a couple of themes that came up that we will be taking very, very seriously. One is that I think there really is an exhaustion of the way that things are in college admissions. You know, one of the themes that kept coming up is the fact that we've been using the same sort of ways of evaluating students for success for decades without a lot of change. And isn't it time to really rethink and redesign the entire process, especially in light of racial reckoning in this country, in light of COVID, in light of the fact that, for example, this year, a lot of students don't have access to standardized testing. There was really a plea for the association to lead conversations around what the future of college admission should look like. I would say the second big theme was really, interestingly enough, around transparency, which was one of the topics that you and I discussed last year when we were in person. This real need and a call for the association to urge institutions of higher education to be more transparent about their admission process. You know, we are still sort of coming out of the Varsity Blues scandal, but the media is still talking about it. Last night I was watching ABC News and Whoopi Goldberg was doing a story about Varsity Blues. And so I think there's a lot of skepticism still still in the American public and the international public about how institutions of higher education admit students. And so there was also a real call for transparency as well. I would say those are two of the big public facing themes.
Okay, that must have been pretty interesting. And then you have to come back and tackle all of that.
Well, now I have to go do something about it, Alice.
Yeah. And the entire college admission world trusts you to do a beautiful job with that. You're a great listener. I'm going to quote you now, Angel. You said, "So many things that were sacred in the college admission process may not be sacred anymore. Colleges and universities are reinventing a process that hasn't been changed in over 50 years in the span of a couple months, and they don't have another choice." Mm-hmm. I'd love for you to elaborate on that. You don't need to go too deeply into testing because I'm going to be asking you a whole special question about testing, but I know that that's a big part of it.
Yeah, so we'll talk about testing in a minute, but that certainly is a big part of it because of the fact that so many students don't have access to testing this year. But it's very interesting. One of the things that is really been exacerbated as a result of the pandemic is the fact that a lot of the things that students used and provided to colleges and universities during the admission process, they really either don't have access to anymore, or it doesn't really count in the ways that it would have pre-COVID. So for example, so many students have been told throughout their entire high school career that their extracurricular activities are going to count, and that, the kinds of leadership positions or the kinds of sports that they play would have a particular impact on their application. Now, I'm not saying that that is still not important, because colleges and universities will look at that, but this year they're really only going to have access to what students did in 9th, 10th, and 11th grade, because so many students are not back physically in schools. They may not have access to particular sports. They may not have access to being the president of an organization. And so those kinds of things that colleges and universities use to determine whether or not students, were engaging in extracurricular activities, those kinds of things have gone away. Another thing that's really interesting is that many colleges in the United States use something that you and I talked about as well last year called demonstrated interest. And the way that students would demonstrate interest in an institution was by visiting the campus or attending a college fair or going to a local program. When a particular university came to Palo Alto and, had a presentation at a hotel, and they would sort of mark that you had attended those things. Well, obviously all of those things have gone away, right? And so what is the new version of how a student demonstrates interest online? So there's really a lot of things that were sacred to the process. And I use that word lightly. I don't mean sacred, in literal sense, but that these are just, it was the way things were. And one of the things I'm most excited about is that it gives us the opportunity to ask ourselves, why was it that way in the first place? And is there a different way of thinking about this that is more focused on the student and is better for the student in the process?
I remember sitting at a meeting listening to a representative from Columbia University years ago who said, and I've never forgotten it, our best assessment of demonstrated interest is the student's application. We can tell from a student's application whether the student understands what the match between us would be like. And many colleges that offer a why us essay, that could be the most important piece of writing in an application and the most important demonstration of interest, because a student can show through why us that he or she understands, gets it about what the college offers and why that would be a good match. So I'm glad you brought up demonstrated interest. And I also think, I love your point of view that this is exciting. We get to relook at everything from the ground up. It's not so exciting for kids and families. We know how anxious they are. We can talk about that in a minute.
Yes.
But obviously one of the biggest COVID-related changes involves testing, the SAT, the ACT, AP tests, IB exams, even placement testing at community colleges and four-year colleges. You wrote a really powerful editorial piece about the future of testing in a post-COVID world. Could you please share your perspective on that with us? And I'm just going to toss in here that for people who do the kind of work I do, there's a lot of pushback when we try to tell students, here's one thing you don't need to worry about this year. There's a lot of pushback from parents who are buying plane tickets to nearby states to try to have the kids test, or faraway states. So I'd love to hear more about your perspective on the testing and how we can convince families that they don't need to take extraordinary measures.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting, Alice, and you know, I've been passionate about the test optional movement for a long time. I was actually at the Claremont colleges in Southern California, and I was at Pitzer, who was test optional. And then when I moved to Trinity, moved that institution to become test optional, and, you know, really use the data and the research that shows that, you know, first of all, the best predictor of success in college is not actually testing. It's actually high school grades, rigor, curriculum, and admission officers obviously know how to use that very, very well. But also that in this particular moment in our history where students do not have access to the exam, you know, all of us who work in higher education as well as in high school counseling just really believe that students, that is not the thing they should be focusing on this year. And let me be very clear, and this was part of what I wrote about in that op-ed, to really discourage students from putting themselves at risk. There is no reason to take a standardized test exam this year and risk your life in order to do that. So the National Association for College Admission Counseling, we put together a petition for colleges and universities to sign this year called Test Optional Means Test Optional. And the reason we did that is because I was being approached by folks like you, Alice, who were saying it's wonderful that all these schools have gone test optional, but our families don't believe it. They still feel that colleges are going to, you know, discriminate against these students if they do not actually submit test scores. And so you can actually Google test optional means test optional and NACAC, and you'll see all of the schools there. But also, it's just really interesting to me that, you know, the SAT and ACT are so deeply embedded in American culture as the way to get into college. You need to be successful in those things in order to get into institutions. And we really have reached a tipping point at this point. I think there's testing exhaustion in this country. And again, because so many institutions, one, were already test optional. And by the way, I would mention some of the most selective institutions like the University of Chicago are test optional. So have already sort of made that statement that we don't need these credentials in order to make strong decisions about the kinds of students that would be successful on our campus. But I will say it's been a little difficult, I'm sure, for you on the ground advising students, as well as for those of us that are trying to work at a national level to convince families that they don't need to drive to Utah, my California friends, in order to take the exam. Colleges really do mean that they are test optional, and they will not use the fact that you don't have a score against you in the process.
Do you want to define what colleges mean when they say they're either test optional or test blind?
Sure. So test optional means that if you do have the exams and you would like to submit them, that they're happy to consider them. But also they are making a commitment to the fact that if you do not have a test, they simply are not going to use that for evaluation. And let me just share something, because I think this is where the misconception about not having standardized testing at the institutions that I have worked at, which happen to be very highly selective, both in California and on the East Coast, I actually got to the point recently where the majority of the students that were admitted to the institution actually did not submit a test score. And so, you know, you need to look at that data to understand that really, if an institution is admitting the majority of their students without test scores, then clearly they are not using the lack of a test score against a student. Test blind is very different. And test blind actually means that they will not look at the test score. So please do not send it. It just means that they don't even want to house it in-house. And so that's also a growing movement in the country, institutions who are saying, you know, we're not even going to look at it. And institutions who are highly selective, including Caltech, right, in California. So that is also a growing movement.
Thank you for helping to provide some ammunition. We're going to save the questions that are coming in for the end, but I do see one that we might as well address right now because it's so relevant. Juniors, goes the question, already need to plan for standardized tests. When do you think the highly selective and other colleges will make decisions on whether they will expect the class entering college in 2022 to submit standardized test scores?
My guess is that they probably will be making announcements around this in the spring. And I will also mention that a lot of schools have already stated that they are going test optional for 2 to 3 years. And so you know, the reality is most institutions didn't say for 1 year, they've said for 2 to 3 years. And I think, you know, the other thing I'm hearing on the ground from many enrollment managers around the country is they can't imagine going back to always requiring the exam. So when I say we have reached a tipping point, that's what I mean, that many institutions were already considering this, and as a result of COVID, moved a little bit faster in their process.
Won't it be interesting when we're so far ahead of this that colleges can look back and assess what their classes look like without benefit of test scores compared to what their classes looked like when they used test scores either lightly or heavily? Well, this kind of leads into my next question. I understand from working with college folks for so many years that the people in colleges really want autonomy and they want the ability to set their own policies. And yet some degree of conformity among the colleges helps students and families manage expectations. So for example, the May 1st universal reply date, or certain other deadlines. Do you think colleges are nearing or moving away from uniform policies related to things like the wording of their financial aid offers or the wording of their testing policies? It seems like a bit of a pull and tug that creates anxiety and a lot of work for our counselors and families.
Yeah, that's a tough one, Alice, and I wish I had a really clear answer because I think we're in the
today.
I know you're not throwing me easy questions here. I think we're really in the midst of some change, but there are complexities in each of these issues. One is, as you mentioned, you know, all institutions want autonomy. Every institution is so different in terms of their mission, their culture, their faculty, their boards, what it is that they're actually interested in, and they should have some level of autonomy. But I think where I'm seeing some movement, not only as a result of COVID, but really just a bit of exhaustion around how complex the college admissions process is. I am seeing a movement around the country with more deans of admission talking about how can we put students at the center of this process. But it is really challenging because the way that colleges and universities are rewarded by, for example, rankings organizations, financial bond rating organizations really is about pitting colleges against each other and becoming more selective. And so there are lots of deep challenges there. But, you know, we have things like the Common Application, for example, which is over 900 institutions that have basically come together and said, we're going to ask the same questions, and students don't have to fill out a different application for each of these institutions. So there is some success in areas like that. But then there's the reality of the matter is there's a lot of, one of the reasons this is such a difficult sticking point is because higher education has also become extraordinarily complex. Believe it or not, and I know this isn't an issue in California, but there are fewer students in the pipeline, and we actually are about to enter a demographic cliff in this country where in the year 2025 and 26, we are going to have fewer 18-year-olds. And so there's a lot of challenges for colleges, not just to meet enrollment, but also to meet the finances and the revenue models that they're going to need in order to meet their budgets. And so that creates pressure around maybe we don't have a May 1st deadline so we can be more competitive, and maybe we send out admission officers admission offers throughout the entire summer to compete with other institutions. And so I think the bottom line is most admission officers that I have met, and Alice, you know, many of them, they are student-centered. They have, you know, their hearts are in the right place, but most admission officers do not set policy. Their presidents, their boards, sometimes their districts or their states are the ones who are making decisions that sometimes aren't so student-centered.
How frustrating. Um, yes, I know them and I trust them, but they don't always have the autonomy they might want. Well,
Yeah.
while you're answering these other questions, maybe in the back of your mind, think about this. If you can drop any little teeny hints of areas where you think there might be some great changes that colleges will pretty much all embrace or mostly embrace that will make students and families feel better. So the Dean of Admission at Bowdoin College, who is Whitney Soul, and she's a wise soul indeed, she's written about some of the more concrete ways that students might find the college application process really different now, especially in families that had older kids who went to college before, older siblings. Could you please address some of the sort of nitty-gritty aspects of the college application process, how they've changed, why they've changed, will they change, like things like letters of recommendation, grades or lack thereof, curriculars, which you already mentioned, gap years.
And Alice, just to be clear, because you cut out for a second there, or were you talking in the context of COVID, like how all of these things might have changed as a result of COVID?
She said that in families that have had older siblings go through the college admission process, there might be some surprises in the sort of nitty-gritty application process.
Yeah, I think some of it is, again, dependent on where students are going to school and what they have access to. I mean, there will be students who will not necessarily have access to not just an SAT or an ACT score, but other kinds of exams that they normally would take. I think, and I mentioned extracurriculars earlier, there's going to be a little bit of a different focus this year. I think colleges are definitely not going to place as much emphasis on the 12th grade co-curricular activities. But I do think that there's going to be an expectation around storytelling, that colleges and universities are going to want to know, how did you spend your time? And there is no right or wrong answer. I think it's important to say that. The Common Application actually added an essay about COVID this year, very intentionally, not because they want every single student to write about it, but they wanted to give the opportunity for students who felt that this was really significant in their lives and there was a story to tell around COVID, for them to be able to do that. They also didn't want students to wonder, should I write about COVID? Should I not write about COVID? And so they just decided, let's put the application question out there. But I think one of the things that will surprise students the most is that colleges really are going to be paying very, very close attention this year, not just to grades, because it probably will be one of the few pieces of data that they will have, but around the storytelling that the student does. And so, you know, I've been really advising students this year to pay very close attention to their essays, not to leave it to the last minute. They probably should never do that anyway. But this year in particular, I think colleges and universities, it's one of the few sort of windows that students will have to tell their stories. And then the other thing that I think is going to be very different than what siblings may have encountered in the past is the way students engage colleges this year, right? There are no college fairs in person. So you're not going to show up to a convention center in San Francisco and meet colleges. But colleges and universities in some ways have never been more accessible because they're doing so much online programming. They're really encouraging one-on-one conversation with admission officers, because this time of year, admission officers would normally be on the road all over the world meeting students. They have a little bit more time now because they're at home, and so they're trying to get in front of students as much as possible. And there really is an extraordinary desire on behalf of students to engage. You know, the National Association, we used to do up to 90 college fairs around the United States and Canada, and obviously could not do that this year. And so we took it online. And on the first hour of our first virtual fair, we had 33,000 students log on, which crashed the site, by the way, for an hour. There was a little drama, but we fixed it, and everybody got to talk to the colleges that they wanted to talk to. But it really is, it's a very different way of learning about colleges. And I think that's probably what's going to feel the most different, is not necessarily like, you know, going into the computer and filling out your application and what you actually input. It's really more how you gain the information and also how you access college admission officers.
That answered a question that already came in earlier, or it more or less answered it, because without the ability to visit campuses, this audience member was wondering what's a good strategy for helping students decide what type of school environment they want to pursue. And I think your response really means to engage to the extent possible with everything colleges are trying to do to help students get to know what they have to offer.
Yes. One thing I'll mention, Alice, because I think it's helpful, I'm seeing a lot more, and this is something positive that has come out of COVID. When admission officers visit your high school in person, it's usually just them. What I am finding now that admission officers are doing is that they are Zooming, you know, or creating webinars with students. And so it's great now, because when you're engaging with colleges, the meeting that you go to, sometimes we'll have a student who is a first-year student or a second-year student at that university. And so it's really exciting to be able to have access to students on the campus in ways that you also may have not had in the past. So, you know, really taking advantage of everything schools are offering online right now is important. And I will say this, because we did talk about demonstrated interest, and I know it's a controversial topic. Some people are fans of demonstrated interest, others are not. But I do think it would not hurt if you are really interested in a school in attending some of their virtual events, because you will be registered, they will record that you were there. I just think it could be a way of demonstrating to schools that you're really interested in attending their institution.
Some will count it and others will not count it.
Exactly.
I wanted to tack on to something you said earlier too, and then I'm going to merge these last two questions so that we can get to audience questions sooner. But you talked about how important it is for students to tell their story. And I couldn't agree more, but as someone who is at this season reading essays from morning till night, I'd like to say something that might sound a little confusing, which is that I hope they will find a way to tell their story without an excess of storytelling. I'm seeing vast amounts of narrative, dialogue, scene setting that just really robs words from the word count where you want to tell your story. So think about that, how to tell a story without too much storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm going to merge these two questions because I see them as related, but you can tell us whether you do. I was going to ask you what you thought some of the impacts of this new college world of ours would be on financial aid, both merit-based and need-based, and feel free to define those terms. But the other question I think can go with it is, I've watched you and known you for a long time. Your career has been dedicated to equity and access to higher education. How do you see those issues of equity and access playing out in the post-COVID or during COVID world?
I will say, Alice, I'm deeply concerned. I wish I had positive news to deliver here, but I think, you know, the reality of the matter is higher education is underfunded, deeply underfunded in this country. I actually just tweeted out this morning that the University of Connecticut has announced that they are not going to be able to deliver on their low-income scholarship program this year. They just don't have the funds. And what I tweeted was that this is my fear, that this is the first of many states that are going to have to pull back the funding because simply they don't have the dollars. And so I'm concerned there about the kinds of commitment that states and individual institutions will be making. I mean, higher education was already a sector that was really suffering. And you saw that in the prices that higher education had to charge in order to, meet their revenue goals. It's not because that's what they want to charge, but really the way that the higher education funding model is structured in this country is not sustainable for the long term. And we can have a whole webinar about that. The other piece that I'm concerned about really is that there's a lot of data that is showing that we are really behind on the number of students, and particularly Black and Latinx students, who have filled out the free financial aid application this year compared to last year. And so we worry at the national level that if that data continues, if that rate continues, there are going to be fewer students, fewer low-income, underrepresented students in higher education next year. The reality is, unless they fill out the FAFSA, they're not going to get the funding in order to go into college. And so, we're tracking these numbers at a national level. We're trying to create campaigns. We're partnering with other organizations and also trying to move the needle with policy organizations that might be able to have an impact. But I am worried at two levels. One, that institutions will not be able to keep the kind of commitment they've had to financial aid in the past just because they don't have the dollars or the revenue sources. And then the other piece is that many low-income students, and by the way, I was a low-income first-generation student myself, and this is how I got to college. A high school counselor tapped me on the shoulder in the hallway and said, "Hey, did you remember to fill out your FAFSA? Did you remember to fill out the application?" Those interactions are not happening in person right now as a result of COVID. And so, it's deeply challenging that we are potentially going to see a drop in the number of underrepresented students in higher ed.
I'm very sorry to hear that. And I hope that the creativity of the college admission world will find ways to accommodate more of those students and to inspire more of those students. That just has to happen.
Absolutely.
There are so many questions here that we have just taken in. And I'm going to ask you some of them that I think can be answered fairly generally, fairly quickly. Here's an interesting one back to the testing. What kind of pressure is there on the college board to just stop making the damn test? This person who asks the question says, all the stress would be gone if they just weren't there. What's your response to that? I know you and I both have worked with college board.
Yeah, well, and we've both done work with the College Board, and it's really, as with everything in college admissions, it's really complicated. But to answer the question, frankly, there is an extraordinary amount of pressure right now. And I will say a lot of the pressure is coming from high school counselors themselves, who are saying, enough is enough. And this kind of pressure that students have, really, if we didn't have an exam, or if we thought differently about how to evaluate students for success in college, that would go away. But again, there's so many different layers, right? I mean, there is, colleges are evaluated for success sometimes based on what their average SAT score is for the students coming in. So it's not just about the College Board. There also has to be a fundamental paradigm shift in this country around how institutions are evaluated for success. And there's a lot of different organizations tied into this work. So the pressure is there. I have never seen so much pressure on the College Board than at this moment.
Okay, keep us posted on that.
I will.
Another question that I think many would be interested in is that you talked about some of the financial limitations on colleges. If a student is looking at colleges for particular programs, whether they are academic or extracurricular or whatever, how can students assure themselves that those programs might not be cut by the time they get there? What's the best way to get a handle on what will and won't be available?
That's going to be a tough one because colleges and universities are doing a lot of cutting right now. But what I would say is this is why being in contact with admissions officers directly is really important, and why attending those information sessions online and going into the Q&A, these are questions that admissions officers are prepared to answer. Now, I will say there's never a 100% guarantee. But the reality of the matter is most institutions that are going to be doing, cutting of majors or programs, they will be making those announcements before a new class comes in. I'm not going to name institutions, but if you just Google right now, there are various high profile institutions out there that are doing this. And by the way, not just majors, but also cutting sports teams and cutting other areas that are very, very expensive. And these are very difficult decisions. They're not doing it, lightly, but they are really trying to do it now so that the incoming classes can make their decisions based on the programs that are going to continue. But I would say holding schools accountable and asking them those questions during those information sessions is critical.
Another thought I've had as I've talked to students about this is that I think you can tell a lot about a college by the way it handled the COVID situation last year. Students and families want the colleges to care about them, to take good care of them. And I think if students and families take a close look at what happened at colleges this past spring, they could learn a lot about the values of that institution.
Absolutely.
Another question from the audience is about the pressure on kids to apply early decision. And some of this pressure is coming from institutions that we think of as, higher consciousness, awareness, but students are getting invitations to apply ED with some pressure attached to them in the form of money or other offerings.
Yeah, I mean, that doesn't surprise me. And I think a part of it is because institutions, regardless of where you sit in the landscape of higher education or your resources, they are concerned. They are concerned about making their classes next year. And it's not just because of COVID. It's also, for example, because of a shortage in international students due to not just the politics in this country, but also an inability to get here. I mean, there's so many different layers that are working against our higher education colleagues right now. And early decision is a way to be able to guarantee a certain number of students are enrolled in the class at a certain financial rate. And so I can see that pressure happening. And I will say, having sat in that seat for over 20 years, it's a really difficult process to be able to balance mission, student values, and money, because that is, that really is very, very challenging. And again, I think if I were to evaluate institutions right now, I would really sort of think more along the lines of what you just said, Alice. How did they handle things during COVID? How did they take care of their students? I do think that's a great story and an indication of how much they actually care and the experience that your children will actually have when they get there. But right now, it doesn't surprise me that we have more pressure for students to apply early. But I will say, and I'm a bit of a purist about this, I would say you have to apply early only if you feel it's absolutely right for you. And I would say if you're price conscious, if financial aid is a huge component of your decision making, you might need to wait in order to see what all the different offers might be that you might get in March when all the other institutions release their decisions.
When you're talking about the difficulties that colleges are facing, I will share with you all one thing, just one of the many things that makes students think that I'm a little bit nutty. But one of the things I do all the time and have done for years, and I ask them to do it too, is pretend you're a college. Put yourself in the place of an institution that can't do anything for you at all if they can't keep their doors open. Or pretend you're a college when you're writing your essays and personal statements. Is this really what they want to know? Just go ahead, and people will think you're nutty, but pretend you're a college. I think we can fit in one or two more. This is a really interesting question I've wondered about too. Do you think in a few years, the cost effectiveness of online and hybrid classes will bring the cost of college down to some degree? That's the audience question. But my question is, do you think colleges will turn more and more to a reliance on online education?
Yeah, I love that question because I actually was, I did a webinar like this with college and university presidents yesterday. And it's top of mind for them. But here's what we learned during COVID. So, months ago, so when COVID happened, I was still on a college campus before I arrived at NACAC. And the biggest fear that we had was, oh my goodness, no one's going to want to come back to campus and everyone's going to be virtual. And the reality of the matter is that's going to affect our financial bottom line, so on and so forth. What we learned when we opened up the portal for students to raise their hand and say whether they wanted to come back to campus, everyone wanted to come back. First of all, parents wanted their children out of their homes. They had been on lockdown for months. But what we learned was that students still feel the need for in-person learning. A lot of them are doing the hybrid because they have to, not because they want to. There is something about that college experience that's really special for them and cannot be replicated online. But what I will say is I do think we've now arrived at a moment where this hybrid model probably will continue. There will be some for whom the online model, because of personal situations or work or things like that, where that's how they're going to pursue higher education. And in some respects, many institutions were already in that business. But I do think now, especially because faculty members are now used to teaching online and have now really learned this model, that there's going to be a new level of comfortability. But I cannot imagine a future where in-person is going to go away. If this year has taught us anything, is that we need to be in person more than ever.
In the absence of test scores, one of our listeners or watchers wants to know how colleges are going to know how to assess grades. The whole idea of standardized test scores has been considered in the past a way to sort of normalize grades. There are schools with high grade inflation. There are schools where B doesn't, might be the highest grade a student can get. Our audience member wants to know, how will colleges be able to assess GPAs and transcripts?
That's a great question. And something that comes up a lot in the test optional movement. And the reality of the matter is colleges and universities were already doing this. Colleges, one of the reasons why admissions is such a personalized process and also very labor intensive is because admission officers basically divide their applications by territory. And so if you read Northern California, you become an expert in those schools. You know every single high school, you know the curriculum, you know the counselors, you're probably the person who goes and visits those schools. And so there is a deep level of knowledge that admission officers have there. I think that the thing that people struggle with, and I wrote about this in the op-ed that Alice mentioned, which I think my website is on the in the chat box. You can download any of the articles I've written there. That, the SAT was sort of created with this mindset of the great equalizer. It wasn't the great equalizer back then, and it definitely isn't the great equalizer now. All of the data shows that students that are wealthier are, basically have a lot more advantage around SAT prep and all those kinds of things. What I learned as an admission officer at a test optional institution is that the students that were low income first generation who perhaps had lower SAT scores, whom we admitted because they had higher grades, did just as well, sometimes better than those students who submitted the scores and came from wealthier backgrounds when they arrived on the campus. And so, I don't think colleges and universities are actually really concerned about this issue of the great equalizer, because we all realize that, every school has different resources. But really the job of the admissions officer is to figure out whether or not the student has had enough of a competitive curriculum in order to do the work on their campus.
Here's a big sort of overarching NACAC type question. How can families assess the financial health of institutions that interest them? Some colleges have closed, some colleges seem to be on the edge. What type of research can families do to get a handle on the relative financial health of an institution?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's a tough one because oftentimes institutions of higher education hold that very close. But there are things that are very public. You can look up an institution's Moody's bond rating, for example. And so, while that certainly isn't a perfect system, it talks about the kind of, there's an ABC sort of system with the bond rating. And those, having been on the other side of that, where I had to report data and information to the bond rating agencies, that helps to determine whether or not these bond rating agencies have faith in the institutions in terms of their financial health. So that's one way to sort of look at it. I would also take a look at the institutional research page of the institutions that you are interested in, because a lot of data about the institutions, oftentimes way too much data, and if you're not an academic, a little difficult to understand, but oftentimes you will see a lot of data about the finances there, because institutions have an accountability not just to the government and to their local officials, but also to their alumni who donate a lot of money and want to know how those funds are used. So I would start there, bond rating agencies, as well as institutional research pages.
I know Charlene is going to want us to quit pretty soon, but I'm just kind of curious about whether on your travels you noticed any differences worth mentioning in the kind of attitudes or optimism or perspective of people on the high school side compared to people on the college side.
Yeah, I will say it's all over the place. I talked to some people on both sides, high schools and colleges, who are incredibly optimistic, including me. I am super optimistic about the future, and I think this is a moment of reinvention. And if we seize this moment, there could be a really exciting future. But I will also say there's a lot of concern about the future. Part of that we've already discussed. Higher education was already financially challenged, and now after COVID, how is higher education going to really remain strong? And higher education has to survive because we need it in order for our society to prosper, right? And so there's a lot of concern around finances, I would say. And so on the higher education side, it's the finances in terms of how do we make sure that we can continue to deliver the services that we deliver to students in the way they deserve it, but keep it at an affordable cost. And then on the other side, from my high school counselor friends, they are saying, how much financial aid are my students going to be able to get, or merit aid, for example? So there's a lot of concern. And then just, we already talked about it, transparency. I think the American public and our international colleagues, they want to know whether or not institutions of higher education are going to be transparent about their process. Do they mean what they say? So I think we need to work a lot on that.
On trust. Now, I have so many questions we were not able to answer. I'm a little bit distressed at how many of them were about testing, but I want to remind all of you who are affiliated with the schools that the college advisors and counselors in the schools have the answers to many of these questions. So be sure that you use that resource in your high school to get those questions answered. I know, Charlene, you're just chomping at the bit here. Oh, we lost Charlene. Well, I want to thank you, Angel, for getting together with us and answering so many questions. There are so many more.
I wish we could have gotten to more, but thanks for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Great questions. Go to the schools, use your resources, and those people there know the answers to these questions too.
Thank you so much, Alice and Angel. We wish that we could have gotten to every question. We could have done this for another 3 hours. Angel, everything that you were saying was so valuable. We wish all of the news was positive too, but I really love how he says that he is positive. and sees this as a time of hopefulness and reinvention for higher education. So I think that's about as good a message as we can get for the future of college admission. Alice, thank you for your more than 20 years of experience in the field and your partnership to the Parent Education Series. Thank you, everybody. Stay safe, stay well, and we hope to see you again soon. Take care.